This daf is sponsored by Sean Kashani. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an amud or a daf, please see the description box below and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Ches Amud Aleph in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 58a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara. Let's say you have a non-sacred animal and you shecht it inside the Azara of the Beis HaMikdash. So the question is, how do we know that the meat is going to be prohibited from that Chulin Shenishchetu Ba'azara? And the Gemara is in the middle of a brisa, and the brisa said, we understand by an animal that could have been brought as a carbon, meaning to say an animal without a blemish, but how do you know Hara'uyim Likarev? We understand again, let's say you have an animal that is not a balmum, that's able to be brought. I understand that if it's chulin shenishchetu ba'azar, you can't eat the meat. Minayin l'rabos bali mumin, but how do you know to include even an animal that has a blemish that you couldn't have brought as a carbon anyway? And the Gemara continues, the Brisa continues, marba ani bali mumin shekein min hamachsher. We can include an animal with a blemish because that's at least from a species that is kosher, that is able to be brought as a carbon. And the Brisa continues, minayin l'rabos esachai. And how do you know to include? From where do we know to include the wild animal which cannot be brought as a carbon, even as a species, it cannot be brought as a carbon. Marbani esachaya, and the Brisa says we include the chaya shehi b'shchita kebehema. It's similar to a behema because it's shechted. Minayin l'rabos esaofos, and from where do we know to include the birds? Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says v'shachatu, v'shachatoso, v'shachatoso. Again, it says that you're going to shecht it 3 times. This is similar to the limud that we had in the Brisa on the previous amud. And so again, therefore, you see to include all of these cases in all of these situations of chulin shenishchetu ba'azara, there's going to be a prohibition to eat the meat if you shech this chulin in the azara of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Brisa continues, Yochel lo yishchot. Now I might think you can't shecht it. V'im shachat yashlichenu lifnei klavim. But let's say he does shecht this chulin shenishchetu ba'azara. Maybe he could throw it to his dogs, meaning to say maybe you're allowed to get benefit. You're not allowed to eat the meat, but maybe you can get hana. And to that the Gemara says, Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, La kelev tashlichun oso. This is a pasuk by treifa. It says by a treifa that meat, you throw that meat to the dog. Oso atamashlich lekelev, and we learn out from that pasuk that meat is thrown to the dog via tamashlich chulin shenishchetu ba'azara, but you can't throw to the dog chulin shenishchetu ba'azara. And Rashi explains, Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, Kevan disrabu hanuch minayu linyan iser shchita. Once we include all of these cases in terms of the prohibition to shecht these animals in the azara, again talking about chulin shenishchetu ba'azara, israbu nami linyan achila ketvimim. So just like animals without a blemish, you're not allowed to eat the meat, so too with all of these other examples, the bali mumin, the chaya, the ophos, you're not allowed to eat the meat. And then finally the Brisa said, via tamashlich lekelev, you can't throw it to the dog. V'hachi mishtami chulin minei. Here's how you learn it out from this pasuk. Di'ilu haikra mayri bebasar hayotze chutz mimichitza. So Rashi explains this pasuk over here of lakelev tashlichun oso. It's talking about meat that leaves its mechitza, it leaves its boundary. How so? Kagon uber shahotzi asiyado b'shchitas imo. For example, let's say you have a situation of an animal, and then there's a fetus inside the animal, the baby inside the animal. It sticks out its hand when you're shechting the mother, so part of it is not within the mother when the shechita takes place. Yalfinon la mehaikra lisura. We learn out from this pasuk that that's actually asur, that's included in the prohibition of treifa. Ubasar basada kagon sheyatsa basar chutz lemechitzaso. When we talk about the basar basada treifa, the meat in the field, that means to say that it left its mechitza. In this case, it left the womb partially. Begoli kasada, it's out in the open like a field. She'ein lo mechitza, it has none. It doesn't have that boundary. Harehu katreifa, that's also considered like an animal that's a treifa. Velo sochelu, it's not allowed to be eaten. Umiyet b'seifen. So then this very pasuk, which is talking about cases of treifa and cases where the uber is sticking a part of its body out of the mother, what does it say? It says la kelev tashlichun oso. That kind of a treifa, you can throw the meat to the dog. Lemuute chulin shenishchetu ba'azara, that comes to exclude chulin shenishchetu ba'azara. That would be something that's not allowed to be thrown to the dog. V'darish hachi, we darshan as follows. Also, who the neser b'yitzias mechitza, only this, which is asur, which is prohibited when it leaves the boundary. V'lakelev tashlichun oso, only that case can you throw it to the dog. The mutter b'hana, it's mutter b'hana, that's only by treifa. V'lo chulin shenishchetu ba'azara, but it does not apply to chulin shenishchetu ba'azara. That is not going to be allowed. You cannot get hana, hanesar al yidei knisas mechitza. That's also something that's asur because you've entered into a mechitza you weren't supposed to. You brought it into the azar and shechted it there when you weren't supposed to. The asur and af b'hana. In that case, it's going to be asur. Even b'hana, you can't derive any benefit. And the Gemara continues, Ashkechinu Mari Yehuda l'Rav Yosef l'Rav Shmuel Berei d'Rav Bar Chana. Mar Yehuda found Rav Yosef and Rav Shmuel, the son of Rabba bar Barchana, they were standing at the doorway of the house of Rabba. Amar Lahu, said to them, Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Hamekadesh bepeter chamor bebasar becholov uvechulin shenishchatu ba'azara. If a man is mekadesh a woman with peter chamor, with basar becholov, or with chulin shenishchatu ba'azara, so it's a machlokas tanoim in this brisa. Rabbi Shimon Omer mekudeshes. Rabbi Shimon says it's a good kiddushin. V'chachamim Omer me'ena mekudeshes, and the chachamim say that it is not a good kiddushin. And Rashi explains, Tanya Hamakadesh bepeter chamor brisa. This is a brisa. And Rashi explains, why does Rabbi Shimon say that in all of these cases it's a good kiddushin? Rabbi Shimon Omer mekudeshes bepeter chamor mechayim. So first of all, when we're talking about peter chamor, we're talking about the firstborn donkey while it's still alive. Rabbi Shimon l'taimi, this is Rabbi Shimon according to his reasoning. To Amar Leil, he said earlier on the previous Amud, mutter bahana. In that case, according to Rabbi Shimon, it's mutter bahana. That's why it's a good kiddushin. And Rashi continues, ubebasar b'cholav. Rabbi Shimon also says that if a man is mekadesh a woman with basar b'cholav, it's a good kiddushin. Rabbi Shimon l'taimi, again, Rabbi Shimon follows his reasoning. Da Amar Le'el mutter bahana. He said earlier as well that basar b'cholav is mutter bahana. And finally, uvechulin ba'azara. Let's say you have chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. According to Rabbi Shimon, that's also a good kiddushin. And Rashi explains, as the Gemara will explain in a moment, Kasava, Rabbi Shimon holds isuro lav doraisa, that when it comes to chulin shenishchatu ba'azara, that's not an isur doraisa. Lo isur shchitaso, v'lo isur hana'aso. It's not usher to shecht it on a doraisa level in the azara. It's not usher to get benefit on a doraisa level. V'lo darish b'richuk makam hachi. He doesn't darish in the pasuk, that pasuk that we had earlier about richuk makam. He doesn't darish in the same way. Ela midrabanan. Rather, Rabbi Shimon holds chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is only an isur midrabanan. The reason why it's usher midrabanan is that maybe people will come to say that if you have, let's say, kachim, let's say you have a carbon that became puzzle after shchita, maybe people will think that's what's happening over here. You had kachim that it became puzzle after you did shchita, shalom nizrak daman, meaning to say, let's say you didn't do the zrikas adam, you didn't sprinkle the blood. The kamesani minai, when people see that you're getting benefit from the chulin shenishchatu ba'azara, they're going to think you're getting benefit from kachim shenifsalu achar shchita. V'yaseh lehanos mi kachim shalom nizrak daman. People are going to come to get benefit from kachim which you didn't do the zrikas adam, which would be a problem, and so therefore that's chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's an isur midrabanan. And so the Gemara now continues alma. So we see from this brisa, chulin shenishchatu ba'azara l'Rabbi Shimon lav doraisa, that if you have chulin that are shechted ba'azara, according to Rabbi Shimon, it's not midoraisa. That's what Mar Yehuda said to Rav Yosef and Rav Shmuel b'rei de Rabba bar Barchana. He said we have this brisa that seems to indicate that Rabbi Shimon says chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is not doraisa uraminu, but we have the following contradiction. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says chulin shenishchatu ba'azara, when it comes to chulin shenishchatu ba'azara yisrafu, then that has to be burned. V'chein chaya shenishchata ba'azara, and the same thing is true by a wild animal, by a chaya that's shechted b'azara, it has to be burned, and that indicates, this sheet of Rabbi Shimon indicates that it is doraisa. And Rashi explains, why does this indicate that? Yisrafu, you burn it, meaning to say velosagi lehu bekvura. It's not enough to bury it, it actually has to be burned. Alma isuro min haTorah. So you see that the isur is a doraisa isur. From the fact you have to go so far to burn it, that shows it's midoraisa. The midrabanan, because if it was just midrabanan, mi mechamrinon kulihai would we be so machmir? Now granted, let's say we're talking about a behema, not a chaya. So there you could understand the gezeira, because we know when it comes to psule hamukdashin, that has to be burned. The lo neimru kachim psulin nikvarim, people shouldn't think that kachim psulim, that they should be buried. People understand that needs to be burned in order that people shouldn't get confused. And people might mistakenly think it should be buried. So if you were going to allow by a behema over here that was nishchatu ba'azara, if you were going to allow it to be buried, people might come to say that kachim psulim also should be buried, and so therefore it makes sense by behema. Maybe we can go so far and say that the behema that's nishchatu ba'azar should be burned. Elachaya, but if you're going to extend that even by a chaya, ikar isur didal lav doraisa, if the main isur of chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is not even midoraisa, mehechi teisi, why would you go so far by chaya to say it has to be burned? Halekal migzar atu kachim, you don't have to make a gezer by a chaya because of kachim. That's not going to cause a confusion. V'lama hi b'sreifa, shreifa, why would you have to burn it? The afila bekvura, even when it comes to kvura, maybe we won't even go that far. Elavada yisurin min haTorah, rather it must be that the isur of chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is midoraisa, usrei fasan midivrei sofrim bebehema gazer, and the reason why you burn it, that's midrabanan, that's a gezeira midrabanan by behema. Dil masi lemeimar kachim psulim the kvura. Again, people might say that kachim psulim, they should be buried, so therefore we don't want that confusion. VaTorah amra yisrfu, and the Torah says when it comes to kachim psulim, it has to be burned. Uvechaya nami gazer. Now once we're saying it by behema, by chaya also, we say it has to be burned. Shelo tachluk bedin chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. You shouldn't make any distinctions in the halacha of chulin shenishchatu ba'azara. Sheishvu chacham devrein b'chol makom shelo yifa'akfu b'hem. The chachamim say that everything should be equal, therefore people will not question what the halacha is. But the point over here is, it is clear from this sheet of Rabbi Shimon, it's clear that chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is midoraisa. And so the Gemara continues ishtiku. So the Gemara says when they heard this contradiction within Rabbi Shimon, they were quiet. They didn't have a response. Also lakami de Rabba, so they came before Rabba to see if Rabba could resolve the contradiction. Amar lahu, and Rabba said to them, Palgu kminchi, it must be somebody who was quarrelsome, somebody who argues, who put you up to asking this question. And the answer to the question is, Hacha b'mayaskin, and here what are we talking about? Meaning, why does Rabbi Shimon say that in the case of chulin shenishchatu ba'azara, if a man is mekadesh a woman with chulin shenishchatu ba'azara, why does he say it's a good kiddushin? If chulin shenishchatu ba'azara is midoraisa, the case over here is kagon shenishchata v'nimtzas treifa. The case over here is the chulin shenishchatu ba'azara was shechted, but then it turned out that it was an animal that was a treifa. For Rabbi Shimon l'taimin, Rabbi Shimon follows his reasoning. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, hashochet es ha-treifa v'chein hashochet v'nimtzas treifa. If somebody shechs an animal, that's a treifa, or let's say someone shechs an animal and finds out afterwards that it's a treifa. Zeh v'zeh chulin ba'azara. In both cases, we're talking about chulin ba'azara. Rabbi Shimon mater b'hana. In that case, Rabbi Shimon says that's not a real shchita because the animal was a treifa, and so therefore it's muter b'hana. V'chachamim osrim, and the chachamim say it's prohibited b'hana, and so therefore Rabbi Shimon, who says that in this particular case where the animal's a treifa, it's muter b'hana, it's there specifically where Rabbi Shimon said that it's a good kiddushin. And Rashi explains palga kantaron raga lachlok al chaveirav. Again, he said that it's somebody who argues with his colleagues. That's somebody who asked this question. And hacha b'mayaskin, and here what are we talking about? Do Amar Rabbi Shimon mikudeshes. When Rabbi Shimon says mikudeshes, shenimtzas treifa, the case is that the animal was found to be a treifa. Rabbi Shimon l'taimi damar linyan kisei adam v'yoso v'yaspeno v'tashlumi arba v'chamisha. Rabbi Shimon in general says by all halachas that have to do with shchita, he says shchita she'ino ru'uya la'achila lo shmei shchita. He says if you have a shchita that doesn't allow the item to be eaten, that's not called shchita. V'chol chiyav v'isr haba'al yedei shchita. And any chiyav v'isr that comes through such a shchita, eino chalala, is not going to apply in such a situation. That's not called shchita. Hilkach isr chulin halala yedei shchita ba'aleh v'alav shchita. Therefore, in this case, by chulin shenishchatu ba'azar, it's the shchita that causes the isr, and over here it's not called a shchita if the animal is a treifa. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Mecharan v'kidesh b'demehen mekudeshes. Let's say a person sells any of these items, and then he's mekadesh a woman with the money, so the money doesn't take that same kedusha of the item, and therefore the money is going to be effective. It's going to be considered to be a good kiddushin. And the Gemara says, Minolan, from where do we know this? And the Gemara says, Midegoli rachmana ba'avodas kochavim. Since the Torah says by avodah zara, v'hayisa chayrim kamo. The pasuk over there says v'hayisa chayrim kamo, and we learn from that kol shatam mahaya heimena. Anything that comes from the avodah zara, meaning let's say money that was used to buy that avodah zara, hareu kamo. It's exactly like the avodah zara. It takes on the same laws as the avodah zara itself, and you can't get hana. And so therefore mechlal, so that implies that's only halacha by avodah zara, but that implies the chol isurim shavat Torah, that all other isurim in the Torah sharu, the money would actually be permitted in that case, and that's why we say that it's a good kiddushin. But the Gemara says v'neilif mina, but why don't we learn from avodah zara to these cases? We should say just like it applies by avodah zara, so to it applies in all of the cases of our Mishnah that the money is considered to be prohibited b'hana. And the Gemara says to that, mishum da'avi avodas kochavim u'shviyas shnei ksuvim haboim ke'echad. The reason is because avodah zara and shviyas, when it comes to the fruits of the Shemitah year as well, that's treated the same like avodah zara. That's called shnei ksuvim haboim ke'echad. You have two psukim that essentially teach the same thing. V'chol shnei ksuvim haboim ke'echad. Anytime you have two psukim that teach the same thing, ein melamdin, you can't learn to other cases, because the idea is, if you could have learned to other cases, you could have just said it in one case, and you would have learned to all other cases. Why are you saying it in two cases? It's to limit it. It only applies to these two cases. It doesn't apply anywhere else. And the Gemara explains avodas kochavim hadiyamrim. When it comes to avodah zarah, we already said by avodah zarah we say that the money takes on the same status. Shvius ma'hi. Where did we see this? By the produce of the Shemitah year. Pasuk says yovel hi kodesh tialachem. It says by the Shemitah year it says it's yovel, and then it says it's kodesh. And we learn out from kodesh, meaning to say from hektish. Ma kodesh tofes as damav. Just like when it comes to hektish, let's say you have something that's hektish bedek habayis and you redeem it. So then we say that the kedusha goes on to the money. So just like that happens by hektish, af shavias tofes as dameh. So to when it comes to the produce of the Shemitah year, also the money takes on that kedusha. So that's the example by shavias. But the Gemara says ima kodesh tofes as damav v'yotze l'chulin. But when it comes to hektish, so the money gets the kedusha and the item itself goes l'chulin. Av shavias tofes as dameh v'yotze l'chulin. Will you say by shavias as well that the money will get the kedusha shavias and the produce itself will be chulin? That's not true. And the Gemara says it's not true. Talmud lomer tiyeh b'havayosatei. The pasuk says kodesh tiyeh lochem, and we learn out from the word tiyeh b'havayosatei. It remains in its status, even though the kedusha of shavias goes on to the money, but the kedusha doesn't leave the original peiros. And the Bryce explains ketzad how so lokach bepeiros shavias basar. Let's say a person uses the fruits of shavias to buy basar, so then elu ve'elu misbarim b'shvias. They both have the halachas of biur on shvias, meaning the basar and the original produce take on all of the kedusha shvias and have the halachas of the Shemitah year. But basar dogim. Now let's say you exchange the meat for fish, so then that which got exchanged will actually, the kedusha will leave it. Yatsa basar nichnasu dogim. The kedusha will leave the basar and it will be instead with the dogim, with the fish. And bedogim yayin, let's say takes the fish to exchange it for wine. Yatsu dogim nichnas yayin. So then the fish will leave the kedusha shvias and instead the wine will have it. And beyayin shemen, let's say takes the wine and exchanges it for oil. Yatsu yayin nichnas shemen. The yayin, the wine leaves and the oil enters. Haketzad. So therefore, how does it actually work? Acharon nitvas b'shvias. Whatever the last thing is that has the kedusha shvias. Upeirei atzmo aser. And the original fruits always remain aser. And so therefore, you see again when it comes to the produce of shvias, even though the kedusha can go on to something it's exchanged for, the kedusha does not leave the original peiros. And the Gemara in any case says hanich laman darmein malamdin. Now all of this works according to the one who says shnei ksum haboim ke'acharein malamdin. So then we say when it comes to avodah zarah, when it comes to shvias, there we say it's tofesas domeh, but it doesn't apply to the other cases of isuri hana. El laman darmein malamdin. But according to the one who says that shnei ksum haboim ke'achad, you could learn out from there. So it should be true by all cases of isuri hana. We should say that the domim, the money as well, is aser b'hana. Ma'ikol amemer. What are you going to say according to the one who says shnei ksuvim haboim ke'achad malamdin? And the Gemara says to that miyute ksivi. There are exclusions that are written as well, excluding other cases. Ksiv hacha ki chayrim hu. It says ki chayrim hu. Ksiv hasam yovel hi, and it says yovel hi. Meaning again by avodah zarah it says ki chayrim hu. By shmita it says yovel hi. So he in midi achrina lo. We learn out it only applies over here. It doesn't apply anywhere else. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, HaMekadesh b'trumas uv'ma'isrus uv'matanos uv'meichatos uv'eferchatos. If a man is Mekadesh a woman with truma or ma'isr or matanos, that refers to the gifts that are given to the Kohanim. And meichatos and eferchatos, some have the girsa here of efer para, means to say the meichatos is the water that they create from the ashes of the para aduma to sprinkle on individuals to purify those who are tamei meis. And the efer para is the ashes of the para aduma. With all of those things, harezum kudeshes, that is a good kiddushin. V'afilu Yisrael, even if the person, the man, is a Yisrael, meaning to say, we're not talking about a Kohen, let's say over here, who receives the truma, who really owns the truma. Even if we're talking about a Yisrael, it's going to be a good kiddushin if he uses truma, meiser, etc. And Rashi explains of matanos. What are matanos? Hazroa v'halachayayim v'akeva. That's the zroa, l'chayayim, and keva. Those are the parts of the animals that are given to the Kohen as a gift. V'afiluhu Yisrael, even if he's a Yisrael, v'kasal kadaitach. Now, right now, we think it means as follows: Aval pisha ein lo b'chol elu ela tovas hana shebiyado. When a Yisrael has truma, so he doesn't really have any ownership over the truma, but he does have one element of ownership. He has what's called tovas hana. He can decide l'sitem l'chol misha yirtza, to give it to whatever Kohen he wants, and that Kohen, so to speak, owes him a favor. V'gam hi lo zach sela b'tovas hana azu. Now, if he's going to give her the truma as kiddushin, what does she get from that? She can't use the truma. She only has the tovas hana. She can decide who to give it to. She tzricha litnem l'kohen. She's going to need to give the truma to a kohen. V'hamaiser l'levi. She'll need to give the meiser to a levi. Umikdusha b'tovas hana azu. And right now we think that's the explanation of the Mishnah, that with this tovas hana, it's able to be a kiddushin to kasavar tovas hana mammon, because the Tana of this Mishnah holds that tovas hana is mammon. That's the explanation of trumas, meisers, and matanis. And the Gemara will discuss the mechatos and the efer para, why that's a good kiddushin. And the Gemara says, Amar ulu Ula says, Tovas Hana Eina Mammon. When it comes to Tovas Hana, that's not considered to be something that has monetary value, that is not Mammon, and that seems to go against the Mishnah, and that's what the Gemara says. Eisvei Rabbi Abba Ula. Rabbi Abba asks Ula the following question: HaMekadesh b'Trumas u'Meiser u'Matanos Mechatas u'Eifer Para. It says in the Mishnah, somebody's Mekadesh with Truma, Meiser, Matanos, Mechatas, Eifer Para. Harezu Mekudeshes v'Afilu Yisrael. It's a good Kiddushin, even if it's a Yisrael. Isn't this an example of Tovas Hana? That's Mammon. And the Gemara says, Amar Lei said to him, Hacha b'Yisrael shenaflu lo tevolami beis avi imo Kohen. Over here, we're not talking about a Yisrael that has Truma that he needs to give to a Kohen. We're talking about a Yisrael who actually inherited Truma from his grandfather. It was his grandfather through his mother's side. The father of his mother was a Kohen. He inherited that Tevel. He inherited that Truma. V'kasavar matana shelo hurmu kemisha hurmu damyan. And the Tan of our Mishnah holds that when you have matanas, because it says over here we're talking about Tevel. Rashi will explain why specifically Tevel, but we're talking about Tevel, so really Tevel is not Truma. But the answer is that the Tan of our Mishnah holds that when you have matanas that weren't separated, like in this case the Truma was not separated from the Tevel, but that's still considered as if it was separated, so it's as if he directly inherited Truma, and he actually owns the Truma, and that's why in the Mishnah it's considered to be a good Kiddushin. And Rashi explains, Eina Mammon l'kadesh bo heisha. Again, that's Ula's opinion that Tovas Hana is not Mammon. It's not enough for a Kiddushin. Kemisha hurmu damyan. But again, we're talking here where he inherits the Tevel, and it's as if the Truma was already separated from that Tevel. Hoel vo medes litrum. Since in the end you're going to take off Truma. V'nigmra malachto l'kach, and the produce is completely finished. It's ready that you should separate Truma. V'zocha akohen b'chaya b'Truma shabo. So therefore, if a Kohen has Tevel, it's as if he's already zoch in the Truma. Shlohutal olav ela l'hafrishu l'kach. When a Kohen has Tevel, so he doesn't have to give the Truma, he just has to separate it, and he leaves it for himself. Av yoresh zeh, so too the person who inherits this Tevel, yafrishena v'imcherena l'kohanim, he'll just separate it, and he's actually allowed to sell it to Kohanim. He doesn't have to give it to Kohanim. He's considered to be the owner now. He could sell it to Kohanim. V'chein hitim kren, and if he gives it to her for Kiddushin, she can sell it, meaning to say that it has actual value. And Rashi points out, now it could have been, Ula could have said that our Mishnah is much simpler. It's talking about where he inherited the Truma from his grandfather through his mother's side. Why does Ula say that he inherited Tevel from his grandfather, and it's as if the Truma was already separated from the Tevel? Just say the case of the Mishnah is that he inherited Truma. Rashi says it could have said that. But it would have just posed a difficulty. If so what's the Chiddush? That's obvious. And Pshita de Mukudesh. It's obvious it's a Kiddushin. There has to be some kind of Chiddush. So the Chiddush is Matana Shalohurmu Kamishahurmu Damyan. But the point is, we're talking again about a grandson who inherited the Truma or the Tevel, and it's considered as if it's already been separated. The Truma's already been separated. In any case, he inherited, he has full ownership over it, and therefore he's allowed to even sell it to Kohanim, and therefore it's going to be good to be used for a Kiddushin. And the Gemara continues, Boy Minei Rav Chia bar Avin me Rav Huna. Rav Chia bar Avin asked Rav Huna the following question: Tovas Hana Mammon, Oena Mammon. Tovas Hana, exactly the question here. Person has the ability to decide which Kohen, let's say, to give it to. Is that considered money or not? Amar Lei said to him, Tani Suah, we learned the answer again in our Mishnah. HaMekadesh b'Trumas u'v'Meiser u'v'Matanos mechatos u'v'Eifer Para harezu mekudeshes v'afilu Yisrael. A person's Mekadesh with Truma, for example, that's a good Kiddushin, even a Yisrael. Doesn't that show that Tovas Hana is considered Mammon? Amar Lei, so he said back to him, again, this was Rav Chia bar Avin he asked Rav Huna the question. Rav Huna then answered, isn't it taught in our Mishnah that it certainly is considered Mammon? And then Rav Chia bar Avin says back, V'lavu kimna b'Yisrael shenaflu lo tevalim in beis avi imo Kohen. But then we already say that the Mishnah, that's not talking about the case of Tovas Hana, that's talking about a Yisrael who inherits the Tevel from his grandfather, again through his mother's side, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Ches Amud Beis.